Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here today in this virtual world. My name is Dina Mallory. I am the Director of Public Programs at Bennington Museum. Thank you to each of you for being here with us today and for the contributions that you made to participate in today's program. Your support enables Bennington Museum to continue to offer quality programming and exhibitions, even in challenging times like those we are currently in. Our guest today is the documentary photographer Kevin Bubriski. Kevin hails from North Adams, Massachusetts originally, and now lives in Vermont, just outside of Bennington in Shaftesbury, Vermont. Kevin's fine art photography is in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and Bibliothèque Nationale, Paris. And he is the recipient of Guggenheim and National Endowment for the Arts fellowships. From 2016 to 2017, Kevin was a Senior Scholar Fulbright Fellow in Nepal, where he pursued his photography in Nepal's remotest regions. His books include Portrait of Nepal, Pilgrimage, Looking at Ground Zero, Look into My Eyes, Nuevo Mexicanos por Vida, 1981 to 1983, and Legacy in Stone, Syria Before War. His retrospective monograph, Nepal, 1975 to 2011, was published by Radius Books and the Peabody Museum Press of Harvard University in 2014. His most recent publication, and the one that he'll be focusing on with us today, is Our Voices, Our Streets, American Protest, 2001 through 2011. A small exhibition of Kevin's photographs is on view at Bennington Museum through December 31st. You can also purchase a copy of Our Voices, Our Streets from our museum store, and all proceeds from those sales are being donated to a local food pantry. I know that you're going to enjoy today's program, so I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to Kevin.
Hi, Dina and everyone. Thank you so much for taking time to join the event today. And I'm going to start with a PowerPoint of the book we're talking about, Our Voices, Our Streets. And then I'm also going to share a video a little bit later. And I'm new to this technology stuff, so just give me a second to get started here. I want to first walk you through some of the work I've done over the past 30, 40 years. Portrait of Nepal, which came out 30 years ago with Chronicle Books. And that was all view camera, portraiture and landscape photography in Nepal. And then 20 years ago, or 19 years ago, was the 9/11 tragedy. And I went down to New York by accident, and then with great intention, to photograph over my shoulder people viewing for the first time the devastation of 9/11. And then 10 years ago, I was invited to photograph the Maoist fighters right after the end of the civil war in Nepal. So I produced locally in Nepal with a Nepali publisher, a book, Maobadi, about the Maoist fighters and how they're kind of picking up their lives and eventually integrating back into society. The retrospective book Diana generously mentioned with Harvard and Radius Books, that came out 6 years ago. And then a few years ago, New Mexico. And again, looking back, these photographs in the book on New Mexico, the book came out 4 years ago, but the photographs go back 40 years ago when I was younger. My hair wasn't as gray or white back then. And then a book produced out of my iPhone just 2 years ago in the high altitude remote region of Mustang in northern Nepal with collaboration with Sienna Craig at Dartmouth University. And then a collaboration with a good friend, Abhimanyu Pandey. We were part of a a research expedition trip into Northwest Nepal and across to Kailash in Tibet. And so Abhimanyu and I co-authored this book that was produced in Delhi with Penguin Random House in India. And then Legacy in Stone, which came out last year. And I just want to show you one image from that book, The Monumental Arch, one of the great monuments of classical Roman times, destroyed as many other sites were by ISIS. And then this is in the works due to COVID. It hasn't gotten to the printer yet. Again, a local Nepali production with all Nepali designer, publisher, writers. And this is looking back at the Nepal earthquake of 2015, almost 6 years ago now. So stepping into the current moment, this book, Our Voices, Our Streets, came out this spring, and it's been a very quiet launch due to COVID. We all have many things on our minds, the political process that's ongoing, the pandemic that is growing immensely, almost exponentially right now. So we're living in very difficult and dangerous times. And it was that same urgency I felt in 2001. My family and I were in Bali for fall semester 2000. We learned about the election from afar in Indonesia and came home, and I made a point to get down to the inauguration of George W. Bush. It was a very unsettled time in America. You all may remember, as unsettled as things are, maybe more or less kind of the same uncertainty. And so at the inauguration, there were tens of thousands of people protesting against the inauguration, saying that the balloting, the crisis over the ballot counting in Florida was improper and ultimately decided by the Supreme Court. What was interesting was how graciously Al Gore conceded to George W. Bush. And that was in a time of extreme voting uncertainty. There's a bit more certainty in the vote right now, but we haven't been able to move very far forward yet. This is not in the book, but I just had to include it. It is from Bush's inaugural in 2001. Those who cast the votes decide nothing. Those who count the votes decide everything, a quote from Joseph Stalin. And we're in the middle right now of vote recounts and uncertainty about the election that just happened a week ago Tuesday. So you get a taste and a flavor of what the streets looked and felt like in 2001 at Bush's inaugural. What I do with I'm shooting with a Hasselblad camera, analog film. So every picture that you see here came out of off of a roll of film that had to be processed in the darkroom, and then contact printed and printed through the enlarger and through wet chemistry. After the inauguration, I returned to New York, and these are selections from a book I did of about 78 portraits of people looking at Ground Zero. My first experience at the site, I was criticized pretty heavily and threatened by the FBI, the New York Police Department, plainclothesmen, saying, if you point your camera at the devastation, we're going to take your camera and confiscate your film. So it encouraged me to look behind me. Russell Baker in the left side of this image, I didn't know who he was at the time, but he was an illustrious writer for the New York Times. And so basically what I do when I'm out with the camera is I'm looking quietly for, I guess, iconic imagery. The streets can be very chaotic. There's a lot of busyness, a lot of static, as you've seen watching TV lately through the election process lately. And what I do with the view camera, not the view camera, with the Hasselblad medium format camera, is try and find a piece of what's there and take just what's within the frame, which makes me think of my first photography assignment up at Bowdoin almost 50 years ago. And the assignment was The Edges and Beyond. And it only dawned on me later that was all about frame, all about what's inside and outside of the visual photographic frame. Back to Bennington almost 20 years ago, almost exactly 19 years ago, Veterans Day. So I can find that I'm photographing locally in my neighborhood, as well as overseas. Somehow my eye and the camera gives me a common denominator with which to look at the world and interpret it and grab certain pieces of it to remind myself of what I saw, acknowledge what I saw, but also to share with others. The World Economic Forum protest in February. These were very contentious times after the election that was very difficult to come to grips with in 2001. But then it was also post 9/11, a lot of uncertainty in the streets of New York and elsewhere in America, threats of terrorism, and then also the drumbeats of going to war with Iraq. And many people did not understand the intention behind going to war with Iraq because the 9/11 terrorists were mainly Saudi Arabian passport holders. This is the first anniversary after 9/11, and you get a lot of mixed messages, as you do now in the American political landscape. This is perhaps an Indigenous Native American working at the Ground Zero site. So you have the T-shirt juxtaposed to the words on his hard hat. And you see the solemnness in people's faces. That's what I look for when I'm with the camera. I even look for that essential sense of something important visually going on, whether it's a portrait or a picture of a tree or a landscape. But there's a solemnity to these images. Of course, it's the anniversary of 9/11. But again, I'm always trying to find something that can be significant out of a large scene to take away and put into the single frame. A quote from Howard Zinn, 2006, is when he wrote the afterword for my book. We thought that the book would go to print way back in 2006, but there was a lot of uncertainty and unease among publishers as well. And there was really no one comfortable in the publishing world who wanted to deal with this work because there was such contentious feeling politically in America at the time. This is Four Corners, downtown Bennington. Now, because of the screen share, I cannot read the quote there on the right, but it's a quote from Galen Ulrich Teichi. She's now in her mid-20s, but she's looking back at when she was 10 years old, and she's on the street here with her aunt, who's mentioned, Lauren, and learning about how to be expressive politically. And then this next image is of Galen taken that same day when she's 10. And you can probably read the text. I can't because it's covered up by you who are present watching. But she describes how empowered she was to be on the street and what the flag meant to her. And also the power of, as a young 10-year-old, taking that action to be on the street. Very powerful action. Next, I was down in Washington, D.C. in the spring of 2002. There were over 100,000 Muslim Americans that marched in Washington on that Saturday. You see the juxtaposition again of political points of view in these two images. And you see a conservative, Orthodox, Jewish man of the cloth here marching with the Palestinians. So I don't know all the nuance of what's going on politically. What I do is I make images, and a lot of these images have a resonance that go way beyond the moment that I took the picture. And as we've learned from looking at Galen's photographs, that every picture has a deep story that I don't know about. Who is this young boy in the right-hand image? What's his story? Who is he now, 18 years later? And the policeman on the left. And remember, look at these, the officers behind him with DSLR cameras. That's a very old style technology compared to drones and high-powered, high-resolution capture that we have now. The next day, a big mobilization against the World Bank. And several of my kids, I think their favorite image is the right-hand one. It's kind of emblematic of how a lot of younger generation feel right now in terms of balancing capitalism and global warming concerns. Lucy McKeon mentions this image in her introduction to the book as to, isn't that quaint? You know, a handsome young man in a suit coat and a necktie with a beautifully made, handmade sign, Republicans for a sensible foreign policy. And then other signage. I just have to mention for this book, I probably shot over 500 rolls of film, not necessarily with the intention of a book, but just because I felt as a documentary photographer, this was my job to pay attention to what was going on in America for that decade. Now, this is the morning after shock and awe began, the beginning of the Iraq War. We're at Four Corners in downtown Bennington. There was about a dozen and a half people went into the street and protested as an act of civil disobedience. There's Nathan Wallace-Senft, one of our neighbors from North Bennington. And then I have to go forward. And then I can't read this, it's blocked on my screen, but this is a grabbed from the label in the exhibition at the Bennington Museum right now. Jamie Franklin, the curator, put this together from his conversations with our Bennington Police Chief, Paul Doucette. And what you get in this paragraph is Paul Doucette's reminiscence and recollection of that day, that morning of civil disobedience. And so again, so many people have been caught by this image of Officer Doucette arresting a young woman on the street at Four Corners the day after the war started. And so here we get Paul Doucette's voice brought into the image that so many people find intriguing and complicated and unresolved and mysterious. And then the opposite of mysterious is this fellow literally wrapped, not just wrapped in the flag, but wrapped in a huge, gigantic flag. This was the second anniversary, 2-year anniversary after 9/11. And then back to New York City. This is right after the war started. This is the Saturday after the Iraq war started. There were over 200,000 people marching in protest of the war. And then there was a major conflict between protesters and police at Washington Square Park. Less than a month into the war, one of our Bennington young men was killed in action. I'm sorry, I don't have the caption here. This is Eric Halverson. And in the book, his mother, Dorothy, wrote a beautiful 2-paragraph tribute to what it is to be a Gold Star mother, what it is to have lost a son or a daughter in war. And so this next image was at the cemetery after the governor, after the high-ranking officers and invited guests had left the cemetery. And I lingered because I wanted to just show the solitary emptiness of the graveyard, of the cemetery, and of Eric Halverson's casket as well. On the other side, a year later, was the welcome home parade for Private Ricky Green. And I'm going to read this real quick. I was manning, this is from Ricky, a quote he gave to me. I was manning a machine gun on a Humvee, and I was hit by a gun turret of an M1 Abrams tank while we were traveling at speed of excess of 60 miles an hour. I don't remember all the details because of traumatic brain injury, but this is the true story as far as I've been told. My whole face is reconstructed with 13 titanium plates and 70 or so screws. And Ricky, by the way, also just authored a book called From Zero to Hero, recollecting his war experience and the full year he spent at Walter Reed Hospital and elsewhere in recovery and reconstruction. The Republican National Convention in New York City, again, 200,000 or more protesters marched through the streets. Some of these pictures show the dichotomy, the polarity of political expression in America as we see now in this current moment. I love that. Think, it's patriotic. Be informed, it's patriotic. Have access to facts, patriotic. And then these parents who are so distraught that they're actually going out into the street with posters of their dead son or daughter killed in the war. The inauguration of George W. Bush, the second inauguration. And this is in the blue zone. Enough people recognize me from a reception I wiggled my way into the night before that I was invited in to be with some of the higher end contributors to the Bush campaign. And then the flags placed in distress along the inauguration route. Rutland, back home to Rutland, an hour up the road from here in Bennington. And then another major anti-war march, September. And here you see the parents again with the posters and pictures of their deceased sons lost in combat in the Iraq War. And it's just so powerful to see these images. And I actually, on some of them, I was able to research who Jacob Palmetier is and who their sons and daughters are. And I want to take you to this next, I think I may have lost it, but there's one story that was written up, a long story written up in the New York Times about one of the lost deceased soldiers. And it's just incredibly powerful what you realize the families have dealt with. And then again, the polarization, people pro Bush's war in Iraq and those against the war in Iraq. You have Vietnam veterans on the right, and then a father who's lost his son in the war. Buffy St. Marie, the Native American singer, well known along with Pete Seeger and others who sang and fought against the Vietnam War as well. So here you see this huge mobilization of Iraq veterans against the war, and Jesse Jackson as well. It's a time when we need our artists to prod our consciences, to show us a reality we may only dimly have perceived, to inform us soberly, to move us emotionally. And I really believe that. I think artists can have very powerful words and statements for the community they live in, and with social media to go across into distant lands with their artwork as well, whether it's literature, poetry, street performance. And this is a performance as well. And this is on the 5th anniversary of the start of the Iraq War. Scores of people with these white masks, each with a placard mentioning a specific Iraqi death or the large numbers of people lost in the conflict. And if you know your photo history, and if you know Diane Arbus, a picture she took of an older woman at a Halloween party in a wheelchair with a mask. That's what I was thinking when I took this image. Sometimes my mind is like a Rolodex, and I see something in actuality in front of the camera through the lens, and it brings me back to something by one of the great documentary photographers of an earlier time. Celebration of Obama's inaugural, 2009. And there was a large crowd. I think it was a larger crowd than we've seen at inaugurations recently, even though it was bitter cold. And even with Obama in the White House, we're still at war. And over 1,600 Vermonters were deployed to Afghanistan in 2009. This is at the field house at University of Vermont in Burlington. And men and women from Vermont going off to Afghanistan to support the war effort. And then the 10th anniversary of 9/11. And you see it's still a very somber and serious place of memory. And yet what we have to think of now is 9/11, we lost roughly 3,000 Americans. And now we're losing almost half that daily with the COVID pandemic. Yesterday, the numbers were 1,400 lost in one day. And the curves are going up, not down. And then the book finishes with Occupy Wall Street. When I do a project, I have to find closure. I have to find an endpoint so I can put it away and start something new and not have it sitting on my shoulders all the time. I like this simple gut democracy. The left-hand image is not in the book, but I really like the juxtaposition of George Washington at Wall Street and the on-duty policeman. 99% for a sustainable future. And we end up back at the cover of the book, again, Occupy Wall Street. And then the back cover of the book, this is a Iraq war veteran who illegally went onto the steps of the National Archives to wave the flag. And you can see several photographers documenting him. I'm going to stop the share for right now, and I'm going to take you directly to a video that a student of mine from Green Mountain College, Hissène Abdussabour, put this together. And it's 5 minutes, and you'll see a lot of familiar images, but Hissène has brought in audio from each of the events, and it gives it a certain resonance and power. So this is 5 minutes. I'll see you then.
You're defending a fascist, exploitative state. Watch my back. We not only have a prominent right, but there's a need for us to be here today. So, while you're seeing all those people out there and you're seeing all the cops, remember, these streets belong to us. We have to take care of each other and ourselves.
Who are descending on this site, we're all waking up and getting ready to attend the ceremonies that will take place here. As I say, bagpipers have been making their way to this site from across New York's 5 boroughs throughout the night. Shortly, they will head down the ramp and into Ground Zero. The processionals are led by the pipe and drum corps from each of the 5 governmental agencies that played such a pivotal role.
Militarism will destroy the planet unless we act. The war system is a slave system. How do you speak to a slave and town in the United States?
A ceremony. We celebrate the durable wisdom of our Constitution and recall the deep commitments that unite our country. I am grateful for the honor of this hour, mindful of the
for all of the people around the world who are suffering and watching their loved ones be killed and die needlessly because of the criminals in the house behind me, because of the criminals who occupy Congress, because of the war criminals who are running the government of the United States against the will of the people of the United States.
Story with 3 words that will ring from coast to coast, from sea to shining sea. Yes, we can.
Can you see by the water behind what so proudly we
All right. Thank you so much, Kevin. While folks are, so please, if you have comments or questions for Kevin, please put them into the chat and I will share them with him. While I'm giving you a moment to do that, I would also like to mention that we have been recording this program, and if you would like to receive a recording of it, you will need to contact me at programs@benningtonmuseum.org, because there's a number of folks joining us this afternoon that I don't have emails for through the registration process. So again, if you would like to receive the copy of this recording, please send me an email at programs@benningtonmuseum.org. And if you have questions or comments for Kevin Bubriski, please share them in the chat. And I'll just get us started with, at the museum, we have a small display of 4 or 5 of the photographs from the Bennington area from your book, Kevin. And I think you know this already, but one of them is the picture of Police Chief Doucette arresting a young woman at a protest. And when we were putting the exhibit together, we all agreed that that was a very powerful photo, but we did have some hesitation about displaying it, and wondered, will the police chief be upset by this? And so we reached out to him, and he said, "Oh no, I would love for you to share that photo, and let me tell you the story of that day." And for us at the museum, it was a very powerful moment, because we had seen that photograph as very sort of provocative, and what is happening here, and how is this going to be interpreted? And to then hear his story about how he looks back on that day quite fondly, and that he was thanked by so many of the participants in the protest, and had, I believe, a thank you letter from one of them that was on the bulletin board in the police station for quite a while. It really kind of sent home the lesson that there's always a story, right? That is not necessarily what you might take at first glance, particularly in photography of actual events. There's always so much deeper to dig, and I loved hearing about some of the stories in your photographs today, Kevin. We do have a couple of questions coming in. Richard asks, have you been taking photos at any protests recently?
What a great question. And in the introduction that Lucy McKeon wrote, her last sentence is, and I'm sure Kevin will be on the streets as time goes forward. In fact, because of the pandemic and because I'm 65 years old, I have not been on the streets much because there are certain risks, health risks, and also the dynamic has changed. And I also don't feel like I have, I don't feel like I can take the risk of traveling to New York or Washington or Boston. And then the technology has changed so much now. There are so many people of all ages and all persuasions out there with their phones and with their cameras and loading stuff up onto social media. And so I feel like my work right now is to make sure that this book that just came out gets a little bit of attention. And so I've been basically keeping quiet and keeping a low profile for safety's sake. We do have we have a mask rule here in the state of Vermont, and our governor has also asked us not to unnecessarily leave the state, and for those from elsewhere to not unnecessarily come into the state, because we have to be careful to control the pandemic. That's kind of a long answer, but I would love to be out on the streets. But I also know that the dynamic has changed, and there are many people making sure that everything is seen. And some of the tragedies that have happened this past spring and summer, the deaths of civilians at the hands of police, have been well documented, sometimes by young teenage kids with phones. And so, I don't feel a need to be there just because of balancing the risk and my desire to make those images.
And similarly, along that line, Glenn notes that this all looks so tame compared to what is going on the street right now, and the coup in DC. From George Floyd to the streets of Portland, it is nothing like the tone of your work. Do you think there's still a place for analog photography of street protests today?
Oh, well, whether to go onto the street with an analog camera or not, again, it depends on whether you're trying to boost your likes on Instagram or Facebook or social media, or if you have an extreme agenda or any agenda, then immediacy is essential. You have to get the work out there to let people know what happened in Portland, Oregon last night, or what's going on in downtown Seattle, or what's going on in front of the White House. But the whole idea of analog photography and what I was doing was slowly building this, as I said, over 500 rolls of film I shot over that decade, and I never thought about deadlines. So I think we can do both. Mm-hmm. Art doesn't have to end because it takes a little bit of time to make a work of art. And so we have to think of the long-term enduring qualities of a work of art, the solitude and the silence it takes to write a piece of poetry or to read a piece of poetry, and then to report the news is different. You put on your helmet, put on your respirator, your shoulder pads, and go out into the street and face the tear gas. That's that has to be done, and it's so important that we have young journalists and citizens out there documenting what's going on. What happened in I can't think of the name of the park right in front of the White House on that day when the federal officers cleared it with tear gas and force to make way for a political gesture. That has to be documented. The artists may come along and make something really enduring and significant that has a longer trajectory. Mm-hmm. So there's a place for both. But I completely understand what Glenn is asking there. And we do feel that urgency, to get things right and to get the word out to people as to what's going on.
Paul asks, Do you ever have negative reactions from people you are attempting to photograph? Do you feel that you need to ask permission even when it's a public event?
Right. Yeah, that's such a great question. And again, the difference between if you have your phone or a tiny little camera, people don't even know that they're being recorded or documented. But with a Hasselblad, it's a big camera. It's about this big, and it sits right on my belly. And I look through a mirror and a prism, and so everybody knows I'm there. And people are not fearful of that kind of a camera. They know, oh, that's an old art teacher guy. He's not some kind of anarchist or something like that. After 9/11 at Ground Zero in New York, people were aware of the camera, but I never spoke to anyone. That was a public space. It was a place where people expressed their grief in a public way. So I never had any problem photographing there. In 2002, in April, photographing, let's say anarchists or young men and women with black bandanas. And I was photographing them at the World Bank protest. And I remember some of them just, I was in front of them with the camera and they said, "Get the F out of here. We're not your effing model." And I said, "Correct, right." And I moved on. And so sometimes people are that way. But most of the time, and then I've had police tell me on the streets of New York, "Put down the camera, put the camera away." And I actually had to instruct the police, no, it's my right. It's my First Amendment right to express myself and also to document you on the street. That's my right. That was a decade ago. I had to say that to some police during the Occupy Wall Street. Now I think everybody understands that, yes, body cameras on police are good. They're good for the police. They're good for the citizenry to have accountability. And so yeah, sometimes there is that tension, and I have to be careful about navigating private space versus public expression.
Tortoise asks, and thank you for asking this question, Tortoise, have we also heard the story of the day from the woman that Chief Doucette was arresting? And I'll just jump in and say that our original vision for having Kevin speak was going to happen in May, I think, right? In the beginning of May, right around the time that the book was released. And our original vision was to, of course, have it in person and invite in some of the folks that are pictured in the photographs. I think we don't have an identification for the young woman, but we do know who several of the other people in the photographs are, and are able to reach out to them and get their stories too. And in fact, did some of that. And in the exhibit itself, you will see some quotes from those folks, including one that Kevin shared with us today from I think Galen, is that her name? Or Galen Ulrich, who was there as a child. And it was so great the way that evolved, because that was not originally planned. But we just started saying, wouldn't it be neat to find some of these people, because they're from Bennington, they're right here. So Tortoise, in answer to your question, I don't believe we were able to speak to that young woman, but maybe Kevin knows more about that.
I think that you have a photograph of Chris Williams in the museum right now. He's a neighbor here in Shaftesbury. And then Rosemary Jakowski contributed a quote that's in the book. She was one of the people arrested during that civil disobedience back in March 2003. And then Nathan Wallace-Senf, there's a quote from him in the book. And I don't know if his photograph is in the show at the museum or not, but he participated in that civil disobedience as well. So yeah, that's the whole idea, is that behind every photograph there are incredible stories. Ruth Orkin, a well-known documentary photographer of mid-20th century, she was hired to photograph a summer at Tanglewood. And while she was at Tanglewood, she went to Stockbridge to the state fair and was photographing people watching one of the first television sets, back in the 40s. And there's a remarkable image that she took of a crowd of people, the women with the funny sunglasses. And in the upper right corner is my father smiling broadly. And it's just incredible to see him as a piece of content in a historical photograph from the late 1940s. And to know that he's my father and that he was photographed by Ruth Orkin. So yeah, that's what's interesting. When my pilgrimage looking at Ground Zero book came out in 2002, I heard from more than 15 different people who found the book and found their photograph in the book, including the cover image of the book, which is the woman is there with her mother, and Karen, I can't think of her last name right now, but they were thrilled in a way, in an awkward way, surprised to see their photo on the cover of the book. But she was very appreciative, and she said to me, that photograph says so much. And people said, when I got back to Missouri, what did you think when you got to Ground Zero? What was it like? And she said, I couldn't say a word, but I've shown them the picture, and that picture expresses everything I had to say. And so I heard that from several people who reached me after that book came out to share their stories. And that was very, very powerful. Again, reminding me that everybody in a photograph has a before and an after, and 3 dimensions, and a very rich life of which the photograph is just a momentary sliver.
Kevin, do you know of photographers who are carrying on it's in a similar style work, this sort of artistically documenting major events like these protests?
I have to mention Ruddy Roy, Ruddy, and then last name Roy, Roye. And I had him up at Green Mountain College twice while I was there. He came up as a visiting artist. He's Afro-Caribbean, born and raised in Jamaica, lives now in Bed-Stuy, New York, Bedford-Stuyvesant, part of Brooklyn. And he's been on the street his whole photographic career, 20, 30 years. And he always hashtags his work when living as a protest. As a Black man in America, every day is a challenge, and for his kids and for his community. And so he has been photographing this disparity in America. And when he photographs people, he writes long captions, beautiful. He's a beautiful writer and a beautiful photographer. And so he's been on the street. He was just down in Miami photographing the Trump, pro-Trump people who are talking about the injustice of the election. He was hired by Time magazine to photograph the George Floyd funeral and was embedded for 3 days with George Floyd's family, photographing with the family at the funeral before and after. So Ruddy Roy is, I guess, the person I know the best who's on the street and telling the story on a daily basis. But he was telling the story with an incredible commitment going back decades, because he's a Black man living in America. And every day he faces these challenges. And when we were up in Pulteney together, he would bring to my mind the discrimination that we would experience as we walked down the streets of Pulteney, Vermont. And it was something imperceptible to me, but he was cueing me into what it was like for him. So I think that we all have to be reminded of our privilege and of the incredible disparity that we have now in America and globally as well.
Nancy asks, you've spent years in Nepal and have a special knowledge of Nepal and its people, but you are an American. And how is it different for you to take photos in Nepal and versus in the United States? I'm sorry, that's Bill asking, not Nancy.
Probably Bill and Nancy both.
Yes.
Yeah. Um, you know, it's interesting. Having been to Nepal as a Peace Corps volunteer for 3 years and staying on an extra year and then going back for a total of 3 or 4 more years on fellowships, Fulbrights, etc. So Nepal is a very familiar place and I feel very comfortable there and I speak the language. And so for me, I can come and go into different places without going through, a lot of culture shock. Um, and I just have to mention, back in 1985, I came back from an extended 8-9 months in Nepal, and I was giving a lecture up at Bowdoin College, and my photo teacher, John McKee, introduced me. We titled the talk "Photographer in a Foreign Land." This whole idea of Bowdoin alumnus goes off to Peace Corps to a foreign land, comes back to give a lecture of photographs about the experience in Nepal. And when John McKee introduced me, he said, the title of Kevin's talk is Photographer in a Foreign Land, and I'm not sure which is the foreign land. And that's where I feel now. When I go back to Nepal, I slip right into being with friends, speaking Nepali, dealing with the way life is there, and then just coming back home here to the USA as well. Equally comfortable and uncomfortable in both, I guess.
Avi says the wave of protests after 9/11 seems to be centered around anti or pro-war, and in general, the US involvement in foreign countries, whereas now, post the election and protests since 2016 are centered around issues within the US, right versus left, red versus blue, black versus white, and so on. And Avi asks, was there more of a sense of cohesion as a country after 9/11 relative to what's happening now?
What a great question. And also the disconnect and the dislocation between gender too, the Me Too movement and gender equality, as well as all the other issues. I think two things have changed definitely. One is the rise of social media and the rise of various places for people to get what they want as far as information. Let's call it information. And so we have all these different sources for people to get what they want to hear or get what they want to see. And so that's created a further separation between different points of view. And, back in the first decade of this millennium, 2000 to 2001 to 2011, I never felt that there might be people with firearms on the street. I never felt that the security personnel would be using live rounds. I never felt that kind of intimidation and fear from anyone or any side. I did experience a lot of sort of fist fights and scuffles, and sometimes I was caught between pro-Bush Vietnam War veterans and anti-war protesters as well, and I got pushed around a bit, but nothing like what's going on now. What's going on now has really changed. The pitch has just gotten to an extremely dangerous level, and the president's remarks in the second, I can't remember whether it was the first or second debate, stand back, not stand down, but stand back and stand by rather than stand down. And so there's not encouragement for people to come together and to appreciate each other's full humanity and to appreciate each other's difficulties and disabilities and problems. So I think Abhi's right that people are much more vitriolic and much more concerned about their voice being heard. And I feel that as well on a personal level, that I'm losing touch with what's going on elsewhere in the world. I have to make a real point to get away from American media and go to my own sources of, the BBC or Al Jazeera or other sources or the Kathmandu Post, that tell me about what's going on in South Asia, what's going on elsewhere in the world. Yeah, America's really focused on itself right now, and then the two different oppositional groups are just ramping up the dislocation even more, unfortunately. I like to think that the photographs in this book, Our Voices, Our Streets, that there's a lot of common ground, that I approached everybody, whether it was a security person, a soldier, a policeman, a protester, an anarchist. I approach everybody with that same common denominator of that I'm making a portrait of them, that I'm doing what I can with the camera to show them as a full person. And I think that's, it's very different now on the street.
One quick thing and then one more question. Can you tell me again the name of the photographer you mentioned who was with George Floyd's family?
Right. Ruddy Roy, Ruddy Roye.
All
And
right.
when he was a visiting artist up at Green Mountain College, he had 12,000 followers on Instagram. Now he's got way over 250,000, probably 280,000. He's a pretty well-known guy who, which is wonderful because he has such an important voice and it's reaching thousands, tens of thousands of people every day.
Great. I put his name in the chat for someone wanted to know, and just in case anyone else wants it. And then I'm going to ask just one last question. This one from Abhimanyu, and I apologize if I'm saying that incorrectly.
Perfect.
First of all, congratulations on this book. What kind of audience would you ideally like the book to reach? I
was interviewed by somebody about the book who was saying, oh my God, this is so old world. It's so staid and, nice, and he suggested that it should be a book that goes into the high schools. And I think that would be a great place for the book. It's one thing when, people who buy photo books buy the book, but it would also be nice if it can reach more people and remind them of what things looked like in the first decade before the social media explosion. And I just want to mention, I want to thank you all at the museum, you and Jamie and everyone, but also I have to thank John Scanlon and the Scanlon Family Foundation. They, John and the Family Foundation, the Scanlons put forward a very generous chunk of support for this book. And that's how projects like this happen. It requires people to step forward and help out. And now we have to help out our food banks.
It's truly a beautiful book. And I know I mentioned that you can purchase copies at the museum store, but Kevin, you mentioned to me earlier that it's also available at the Bennington bookstore. I know you can get it on Amazon. Right. And I'll be sending in my follow-up a link to where you can purchase it. Are there other locations regionally?
Phoenix Books in Rutland, I think, has copies. Probably the North Shire. I haven't been to the bookstores. I'm kind of staying, yeah. but it should be easily available online and also directly from Powerhouse Books.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to have such a great turnout for this presentation, and it was great to see so many of your wonderful photographs and hear you speak about them. And again, I encourage everyone to visit the museum if you're in the area. Through December 31st, we have a small exhibition of some of the images from this book in our lobby exhibition space. So you can see them in person, and we'd love to see you there. Kevin, thank you so much. And I wish you and everyone else a happy, safe, and healthy weekend.
Thanks, Dana, and thanks to everybody who listened in. Have a good day.